Our panel will be moderated by Jesse Rothstein, who's a faculty member here at the Berkeley Public Policy School. Jesse holds the Carmel Friesen, I knew I would do that wrong, chair in public policy at the University of Southern California, where he is also a professor of economics, and David P. Gardner Professor of Higher Education. He co-founded and co-directs the California Policy Lab, which partners with government agencies to improve public programs through research and data. Rothstein also directs the Center for Studies in Higher Education, which is the nation's first established research institute devoted to the study of higher education. I think you all are in great hands with a wonderful moderator. Jesse, I welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Just have to correct one small misspeak there. I am not affiliated with the University of Southern California, but with Berkeley. But thank you for the generous introduction, and I'm honored to be here today and to be leading this discussion. As you all know, the Trump administration has spent most of this year in open conflict with American universities. His administration has accused universities of being hotbeds of anti-Semitism and ideological indoctrination. He's accused them of breaking laws left and right. He's cut more than $1 billion in federal research funding and specifically targeted a number of universities for more. While some institutions have sought compromise with the White House, others have pushed back more publicly. Berkeley, where we have the pleasure of gathering here today, is currently being reviewed by the administration's task force. As you know, there was a lawsuit that was won on behalf of the university about a week ago that required restoring some of the funding, so we'll see how that plays out. But this panel wants to consider, what does this heightened focus on universities reveal about the relationship between higher education, academic freedom, and democracy? What can we learn from the different ways institutions have chosen to respond, and how might universities continue to navigate these growing internal and external pressures? At a moment when so many of our democratic institutions are under strain, what does the future hold for American higher education? Our panelists today bring a range of perspectives from public and private universities, from smaller liberal arts colleges to larger global research institutions. I'm going to give them very brief introductions. There's more biographies in the program, but we wanted to have time for the discussion, and they're distinguished enough that we could have spent the whole panel with their bios. So the first panelist is Dr. Agenia Clark, the 18th president of Fisk University, Nashville's oldest institution of higher education. Second one is Ronald Daniels, the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University, where he's advanced interdisciplinary collaboration, student access and support, and partnerships in Baltimore and beyond. And finally, Janet Napolitano, our own professor of public policy, founder of the Institute for Security and Governance at UC Berkeley, and former president of the University of California, as well as former US Secretary of Homeland Security and Governor of Arizona. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Now that I'm here to ask the questions, I can move over to this part of the stage. I thought we'd start off with some background. I wonder if I can ask each of you to talk a bit about what 2025 has been like for your institutions and how you've responded. I'm going to have to practice my cold calling, aren't I?
I'll start because I think mine will be the easiest. 2025 has been difficult and challenging to sit and watch. The specific impact, though, has not been that severe yet. So first, I think I need to put Fisk University in context for you. So Fisk University is a very small private HBCU that sits in the heart of Nashville. We're a small campus, about 1,000 students. Everyone knows everyone. It's a very small and intimate, dedicated environment where our enrollment is approaching 70% Pell Grant eligible students. We serve a very different and unique population. But at the same time, this administration signed something called the HBCU Executive Order. I'll never forget when that happened because, of course, the media started calling and asking, oh, what does this mean? I didn't take any media interviews because I didn't know. I read it. I didn't know if it had any meaning or not because it really didn't say what it meant to do or how it impact us. that was the first thing. Then, of course, all the pullback on the federal funding took place. We're a small liberal arts school, so there was not much impact there. But now we're getting into the middle of the shutdown of the Department of Education. Now I think we're about to see what the impact is going to be, as we just gotten communication, I think, this week about where all of the arms of the Department of Education are going to be funneled out to all these other different groups and divisions, and now we're going to have to figure out how that's going to work. So as of today, and I say that with great caution because there's always, well, I should say this, as of this morning, because as I said at dinner last night, at Fisk University, we've just been sort of operating with my neck on a swivel. We just don't know. But direct impact as of this morning, we haven't felt a lot of it. And then finally, I will say this. I loved when the dean was talking about, public policy and the impact on domestic tranquility. What has come out of all of this for Fisk is a huge growth in applications for the limited number of students that we can serve. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the institution is known for bringing a place of tranquility for a unique set and population of students who remain very active and very engaged in this world of public policy and are really actively engaged in what's going on in democracy today.
Thank you. Ronald?
Boy, how nice it would have been to be able to reply to your question by saying we haven't felt much yet at Johns Hopkins. We were first up. As you may recall, early on, after the new administration came in, we lost $800 million of USAID funding. Now, the truth was that was not directed towards us as much as it was directed towards the shutdown of USAID. But we had a number of different activities that were very directly affected by that. Hopkins was the largest university recipient of USAID funding. And so as a consequence, that loss, which came very early on in the administration's life, was a very powerful shot over the bow. And of course, at Johns Hopkins, as many of you will know, we are tremendously dependent upon the federal government. It's always interesting. We were having a discussion beforehand as to the difference between public and private institutions. We think of ourselves as a private institution, but the reality is we're a private institution where, wait for it, 50% of our revenue comes from one source, the federal government. We have about 35% just comes from NIH, NSF, NASA, and so forth, but we get another 15 or so percent of our total budget going to the Applied Physics Lab, which is part of Johns Hopkins University. So to the extent that, as we've seen, the whole issue of support for research, for this extraordinary partnership that the federal government and America's research universities have had for over 80 years, to the extent that that is called into question and there's a real attempt to resile from that on the part of the federal government, that's been very consequential for us. So first impact was the loss of the $800 million of grant support for our activities sponsored by USAID. Then, like so many other institutions across the country, we experienced the grant terminations that basically were directed to those grants that had a DEI component to them. And again, we were not unique in that regard. And that's, at this day, something in the order of $58 million of grant terminations. But here's what's really significant and quite consequential, and from my perspective, deeply distressing, which is that we're now seeing, and just looking at the end of the federal government's fiscal year, what's happening with new grant awards. And year over year, we are down about 45% in value in terms of new grants awarded to our faculty. So if this remains in steady state, and this is the new normal, what we're going to imagine is a just really dramatic contraction of the scale of research activity that's conducted at the university. So we're seeing, just in terms of the support for the partnership, the belief in meritocratic allocation of research funding, something that, as we know, has fueled so much of this country's success in so many different dimensions. We're seeing what is clearly, at least insofar as Johns Hopkins is concerned, a very dramatic retreat from that partnership. And here's what's really interesting, and what we really don't fully understand yet. But yet again, the last couple of days, the commitment on the part of the granting agencies to having spent down their full budgets for this past fiscal year was reiterated. So if we're down so dramatically, and I've talked to a number of colleagues who lead universities, blue state, red state, public, private, we're all experiencing, not necessarily to the same degree we are, contraction. So the question is, where is it going? How is the administration interpreting its responsibility to fuel this extraordinary and, I think, quite impactful partnership that, as I said before, has driven so much of the country's success since the end of the Second World War?
Janet, I'm guessing you're feeling pretty good about the former president part of your title right now, but I'd love to hear your
Yeah, I was
perspective.
just thinking timing is everything. But this whole attack on higher ed in the administration, when you back up the bus a little bit and think about it, I know the meeting here today is about democracy, and in higher ed we talk about democracy and teaching principles of good citizenship and academic freedom and all of that. But as a former basically administrator of a large public research university system, it's made me think about the relationship between our nation's universities and the federal government in a different way. How the whole research enterprise, as Ron suggested, is entangled between universities and the federal government. How the federal government, over time since World War II, has accumulated huge financial leverage over universities, and it is using that leverage now without any modicum of due process or order or what have you. It's just like taking an axe and going whack, whack, whack. And I don't think we still see all of the consequences. Now, we're the University of California. We think we're a state public university. But think about this for a moment. I think, if I recall correctly, 10% or so of the UC budget comes from the state of California. 10%. Meanwhile, the university gets $17 or $18 billion from the federal government a year. 6 or 7 billion in research grants, another 9 or 10 billion to fund the teaching hospitals. And think of the leverage they can use there. We do transgender care. We teach transgender care at our medical schools. Well, they can threaten to cut off Medicare and Medicaid funding. Boom, whack. And then another 2 billion or so in student financial aid, which, by the way, Pell Grants do not cover the cost of a higher education in the United States for any institution. So, but I use those numbers just to give you a sense of, even though we are a state public university, we are totally entangled with the federal government, gives them leverage. They've shown a willingness to use that leverage. What they haven't shown is, what is their vision? What is their vision for higher education in the United States? How do we prepare the next generation? How do we continue to advance economically, scientifically, medically, et cetera, if we're cutting off our seed corn now? And I think they haven't answered that question because my view is they don't have a vision. The vision is tear down, not build up. And that is the political problem that we need to confront.
Thank you. One aspect that I've found very interesting about this year as an academic is the degree to which it's been a collective action problem among universities. I think when I teach Prisoner's Dilemma, I'm going to be using this as an example for a long time to come. And I guess looking beyond your own institutions, I'm really interested if there are institutions that you see as exemplars in handling that collective action problem well, getting us towards a good equilibrium rather than a bad one. And generally, whether there are structures beyond universities, maybe the AAU or other organizations that have been helpful in coordinating collective responses. I'm really hoping somebody has an answer here because I haven't seen it.
Well, why don't I start? Hopkins, like several of the institutions within the UC system, is a member of the American Association of Universities. It is the organization, as many of you know, that has about 70 research universities, public and private, red and blue state, and has been in existence for well over a century. I think it's fair to say, just at the level of the AAU, I've been impressed actually by the extent to which that organization has taken on an entirely different role than it has in the past. The AAU has now initiated, I believe, 5 different suits as against the administration. It started first with the NIH, with the indirect cost issue, as you know, the decision by the administration to reduce the level of support for indirect cost recovery for the research grants that we receive. In the case of Johns Hopkins, the imposition of a 15% cap resulted in about a 75% reduction in so-called F&A recoveries. It's just a cost of research, of course. But for us, that was, in steady state, that'd be about a $300 million loss, so quite consequential. But the AAU led in the case of the reduction in NIH funding, and then proceeded with NSF, DOD, NASA, basically led the charge. And more than that, not only did AAU seek to organize that litigation, but several institutions, including ourselves, and for 2 different suits, let our name stand in support of that. The AAU had never sued anyone in its 100-year life. That the fact that this organization was initiating suits, that was a significant move forward in terms of how the institution met this moment. It's also, I think, worthy to note the extent to which the membership of the AAU also imposed assessments on itself and substantially stepped up its activity and advocacy, set up for the first time a 501c4 to be able to do direct advocacy. So I think that's actually significant. Most recently, the AAU, yet again, has joined suit with Chamber of Commerce to basically deal with the H-1B issue. So this is again, for an organization that didn't see itself in this kind of role, this is a significant move forward. So I would say at that level, I think it's been encouraging. I would say though, what's significant is that that the universities, how lonely they are in some sense in speaking for our cause. And we know that to the extent that we are the subject of a pretty vigorous campaign that's been waged against us in a number of different fora, ultimately, it's not about collective action necessarily among the universities. It's collective action among all the other institutions, individuals who have a stake in our success. And so I think that's where I think it's really important as you discuss with your students collective action problems. I think it's a question of, where are the downstream industries that are so incredibly dependent on our graduates and on the research innovation that comes out of our institutions? Where are the graduates, who say, my God, what my 4 or 6 or 7 years has meant in terms of the possibilities it's given me at, not just financially, but at a number of different levels. I think this is where we have to, again, think about this in a broader frame, because I think the conundrum for the universities is we know, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this, but as noble and as good as we feel, and as I do about so many parts of our mission, we know that we're also not without blemish. And those issues are very much in play right now. But in that setting, our just turning up the volume on how great we are and vital we are to the national enterprise is not nearly as good as if others are speaking on our behalf.
Anyone else want to jump in, or?
No, I think those comments are well served. But it's interesting, this kind of national banging on universities and higher ed predated this administration. I mean, we've been criticized of being liberal, communist, whatever, bastions for a while, indoctrinating our students as if our students don't have brains. And we've kind of just taken it quietly. And there's nothing like a good attack to get your fighting spirit up, right? I'm grateful for what the AAU has done. 8 of the 9 undergraduate institutions in the UC are in the AAU, so it's an important institution. It's been litigating, it hasn't really been speaking. At least as far as I've been able to discern. And that's a judgment call from that organization. The thing to recognize, however, is that higher education in the university is incredibly diverse. There are 3,500 plus higher education institutions that grant degrees. Roughly 1,500 are public, 2,000 are private. There's big R1 universities like the UC, Johns Hopkins. There are small liberal colleges, private colleges like Fisk. There are state universities, regional universities. There are community colleges. It's an incredibly diverse community. So it doesn't surprise me that it hasn't all spoken unanimously. And what is important, however, is that only a certain portion of that big, varied canvas has been directly under financial attack. And that has been the Ivy League universities and certain public R1 universities. Everybody else is going to see trickle down. Fisk is going to see trickle down. Community colleges are now seeing trickle down as a virtue of the funding cuts that are happening in DC. But the attacks have been focused, and it's that community that really needs to continue to come together, litigate together, work together, and speak up together.
Can I just pick up on something you said, Janet, which I think is an important thing that, as hard as it is for us to recognize here in the academy, and that is the point that you made a moment ago. This attack on higher education and its putative failings did not begin with this administration. We've seen over the last several years, going back to 2014, if you look at the Gallup polling, you've heard the statistic time and time again, but in 2014, 56% of polled Americans basically had trust in American higher education. Just a few years later, that drops to 37%. And what's significant, it is true that the drop is more dramatic in the case of Republicans than it is in the case of Dems, but we've suffered a loss in trust on both sides. And significantly, that there is convergence in some of the narratives across both Democratic and Republican voters as what's wrong with us. The cost issue, the access issue, the complexity of our financial aid. We profess to be places that are committed deeply to equal opportunity, but it's hard to figure out exactly where you line up. A number of us have tried to simplify over the last couple of years the way in which we provide financial aid, but nevertheless, it's complicated, and it's a legitimate concern that's out there. We know that Republicans in particular are really focused on, among other issues, but the issue of the woeful percentage of conservative scholars who are represented in our faculties, particularly in the social science and humanities. It's a real issue. It is a real issue. I will say, starting with my own institution, a colleague of mine, Steve Tellis, published about a year or two ago a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education where he said at Johns Hopkins, in the social sciences and humanities, he said, I am unable to identify a single conservative scholar who is tenured in those disciplines. That's an issue for us. And it's not how people vote. It is, are we taking these ideas seriously and giving our students exposure to these ideas, showing, at least half of America that we take these intellectual traditions seriously. So again, I think part of our problem is that the attack on us is vigorous, it's shrill, it's often just plain wrong. But like so many of these moments when you're under attack, there's also kernels of truth, and how we have the fortitude at the same time that we react so strongly to what is happening around us in higher education, the funding cutbacks, the unrelenting attacks, investigations, and so forth. But at the same time, how do we actually look seriously at some of these critiques and respond to them?
Thank you. So I want to pick up on some of the things you said and think about kind of slightly longer term. And I take your point that it's not entirely the university's job to do this, but the universities do have a role to play. I'm curious how you see the role of universities evolving in contributing to our civic culture, or democratic culture, public trust, a shared sense of public purpose. Do universities have a special role here, and is it going to be different than what it's been in the past? Anyone?
Yes, we do have a role in this. I just think that what we're faced with now is how our role is changing. And that goes back to the uncommon. But I also was sitting here reflecting on something that Janet said, who doesn't take advantage of this opportunity? And that's where we're looking at doing at Fisk University right now. While the challenges have not impacted us significantly yet, we are looking differently at how we are engaging with students, what we're doing with the opportunities that we have in front of us. And it's interesting because while we're focused on it, we're looking at it, deciding what we need to do differently that we haven't done already. Fisk University has had a history and was founded under the premise where our sons and daughters are ever on the altar. We live that every day. That is what every student is indoctrinated in their first days on that campus. We're ever on the altar. So these uncommon times are not lost on us, but by being ever on the altar, we are forever looking at how do we sustain, survive, and thrive. Because for an institution that was founded with this purpose, nothing has ever been easy. So, yeah, it's uncommon right now. We're under attack right now. Things are much more at a heightened level, and the vitriol, unlike before. But it's not like Fisk hadn't already been there before. We were founded there. We have had to figure out how to survive there. And let me go back to the landscape that we operate in. Fisk University is less than a mile from the capital of the state of Tennessee. Need I say more? And since 1866, we have been trying to figure out how to survive there. So the battle and the challenges that we see happening today, we can probably take you through decade by decade of the experience of this institution. And we seem to get to the other side. We seem to figure out how to address it a little differently than the time before. We seem to figure out how to coexist with the capital eyesight from the institution that is in one of the poorest opportunity zones in this country. Our sons and daughters are ever on the altar. This challenge to us today doesn't feel unlike challenges of the past, and it doesn't feel unlike the challenge that we encountered from the day that we were founded.
Thank you. So I want to move to a topic that's come up a little bit, but is a little closer to what I work on, which is access to colleges and to elite universities. It's been expanding access, making sure that universities are serving the broad scope of our society has been a big focus for decades, as have been efforts to try to make university environments more inclusive. But that is all under attack right now. The very idea of access and inclusion is not widely held or not universally held. The efforts that universities have been making have been under attack by the administration. The SFFA decision a couple of years ago takes away a key tool that universities have used to make space for diversity. What do diversity, equity, and inclusion on university campuses look like going forward?
Well, I can start on that easily. Yes. We're an HBCU, but we don't have race-based admissions and never have. Fisk University, since its founding, has never had race-based admissions. So we don't know what our student population is going to look like till they come together for the first time in their freshman year in the Fisk Memorial Chapel for convocation. So this is my second year seeing that. This year I saw more white students than I saw last year. So visually, I could see we had lots more white students than we've had. I would say I probably saw a good 15 to close to 20% more. And the impact and the access part that's been fascinating for us is to observe the difference in the makeup and the representation for this HBCU that does not and has not had a DEI program.
So as you know, California banned the use of any kind of affirmative action in college admissions years ago. But nonetheless, we're a public university, and everybody in California, which is a very diverse state, has a stake in the success of its university and access to its university. So different campuses have done different things, but one theme has been to increase recruitment, to go out into different areas to try to increase that applicant pool. And that met with some limited success. I think during the pandemic, the Board of Regents abolished use of the SAT in applications. I think we need to see the result of that and how it affects the overall applicant pool and the student body over time. It's probably too soon to tell. But there are some interesting statistics about the UC. About 40% of the undergraduates are first generation, first in their families to go to university. And almost a third are transfers from the community colleges, which are a very ripe system in California to recruit students from. And so I think from a public university standpoint, what the UC needs to stand for is excellence and access. And then at some point, Jesse, maybe we'll talk about affordability.
I think, if one, again, thinks about these issues in the context of the university I lead, first and foremost, I think it's important to acknowledge just for us, SFFA had a profound effect on the character of the class that we were able to recruit at Johns Hopkins. I've been president I'm now in my 17th year, which, in dog years, which I think we get to use given the tenure of presidents these days. But, when I started off as president, we basically, about 5-6% of the class was African American, another 10% was Latino Hispanic, and then mixture of Caucasian and Asian students from there. Over a period of years, we were able to really make tracks in terms of increasing our minority representation, and more than doubled those percentages for African American and minority students. And again, for a place like Johns Hopkins in a majority minority city that is Baltimore, these were all changes that really, I think, fueled the success and a healthy culture of the institution. Post SFFA, our first year out, we basically are right back to where we started 16 years ago. So, very dramatic shift in population, reflecting, what was in truth a pretty modest affirmative action program, but it was an affirmative action program that all through the period that we prosecuted this program, SAT, GPA scores, everything increased at the same time we increased the diversity of the class. So I think it's a loss of a real instrument for us. But just in the way that Janet's described, we've basically, at the same time we were worried about thinking about a broad representation around race and ethnicity, so too were we simultaneously thinking about socioeconomic diversity, national representation, and those are still tools available to us. And I think for the last several years, and this is not just true at Hopkins, it's true, I think, at a number of private universities as well as publics, but really have focused on the Pell-eligible population. And, in the case of Hopkins, we basically went from about 10 to, this year it's like 24% of the class is Pell-eligible. So a very significant movement forward, and, not as high as California, but now about a 32% of the class basically is first generation. These are remarkable changes. And what's really, I think, been exciting is just in the past couple of months, we have now basically introduced a great simplification of our financial aid program, whereas you can imagine the concern has been the barbell effect. Well, we know that the wealthy can get in and don't have to worry about financial aid, and we know that the Pell-eligible population will be covered, but what about the broad middle class? Is there a place for them? What kind of assistance are they getting? And so we have announced that basically any student who comes from a household earning $200,000 or less will come to Hopkins tuition-free. Under $100,000 on a full ride scholarship. That's important because that $200,000 threshold represents about 85% of American households. So again, this is something where we feel that's not at risk now in this environment. It's been construed by some as a stalking horse for race-based admissions. It is not. It is basically trying to increase and take seriously this socioeconomic diversity, and in a sense that we want financial means not to be a barrier to entry. So I think these are areas where we still have instruments that we can deploy, but we have to be frank. And we signed on to amicus briefs. We hoped that SFFA would go differently than it did, but we're in an environment now where that's the law, and we'll scrupulously adhere to it. But I think it's been obviously had a market effect on our institutions.
I want to continue this conversation for a minute, but sorry, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. It was the Supreme Court case 2 years ago.
Which banned
affirmative action.
Affirmative
Yes.
action. Sorry
about that. That was my fault. So we're going to continue this for a minute. In a couple of minutes, we're going to open this up to audience questions. There are a couple of people walking around with microphones. We'll come around to you, so get your questions ready. But I wanted to continue on this and talk about affordability. The rough trend over the last couple decades, if I can summarize it, hopefully I won't get the facts wrong, is that tuition has gone up and up and up across almost all institutions. In the last decade or so, in many institutions, financial aid has kept up with it, so that net costs haven't gone up very much on average. Obviously, that's going to vary a lot across institutions. But I wonder how sustainable that is, and whether we're going to be able to continue with that, or what the future of affordability looks like for colleges as costs keep going up.
So a couple of points, Jesse. First, actually, at least according to the College Board, tuition at public universities across the country has gone down over the last 10 years. So that's just one of those things out there. But housing and other associated costs have continued to go up, and we live in the Bay Area. We live this issue, and our students really live this issue, and our faculty really live this issue. The thing about affordability, first of all, you have the sticker price, and then you have what it's really going to cost an individual student. How we ended up with two pricing mechanisms, I do not know. Because fewer and fewer students, even at places like Johns Hopkins, are going to pay the sticker price because they're going to get either a break on tuition, financial aid, scholarships, et cetera, grants. And so the end is, I think the basic number that should be focused on is, what does it cost the average student to get a degree? Not to enter, but to get a degree. And what is the average amount of student debt that student can anticipate? And to keep those numbers as in proportion as possible. When I left as UC president, over 50%, like 60% of our undergrads graduated with no debt. Those that graduated with debt, the average amount was about $20,000 to get to the degree level. And I would say to students, look, that's a lot of money, but it's like the price of a car. And when you drive a car off the sales lot, it immediately goes down in value, but at least theoretically, your education should only increase in value over a lifetime. But nonetheless, people think college is too expensive, and that means they're deterred from even applying and going, and they create lower expectations for themselves. We have to be able to talk about and explain the cost of getting a degree more concretely, more tangibly, and more realistically, and show that colleges and universities are doing everything they can to contain costs to keep these institutions affordable.
So I totally agree, Janet, with what you said. And again, I think this, at least for the privates, this real simplification, just keeping the story simple is a helpful way in which we can do that. If this is what your family earns, this is what you're going to pay. I think that goes a long way, given just the complexity, even to your point, being able to take, well, what's truly the cost to me? That whole enterprise and the complexity of that and the forms that have to be filled out. It's just, in the end, I think it's on us. We've made this more complicated than it needs to be. I don't want to lose this opportunity to say something else about accessibility. I know it doesn't apply to the institutions that are represented on this stage, but it's something that, again, I referred to a few moments ago, this idea of, are there kernels of truth in some of the criticisms leveled against us? we profess to be places committed to the power of social mobility, to equal opportunity, to that Jeffersonian ideal. And, it's one of the things that, to my mind, is most perplexing about a number of universities in this country is that they're still using legacy admissions in the way in which they recruit students. I mean, again, imagine, as we're professing this commitment to best and brightest, irrespective of financial wherewithal, there's still too many institutions that are saying, after all of the advantages that we know students of privilege get in terms of better schools, stable families, better neighborhoods, better summer experiences, and so forth, that at the time of application to universities, we're yet again going to put the thumb on the scales for these kids. It's, I think it's really mystifying as to, particularly after the end of SFFA, that this practice has remained intact at a number of institutions. So I will just say, this is one of the things that Hopkins, and a bit, I'm a Canadian, I'm an American now as well, but this idea that we would have this system was a complete enigma back home. And so slowly but surely, we eliminated it at Johns Hopkins. And by the way, for all the warnings that were sounded that this would be the death knell for our donative activity, we never get a plug nickel again from our graduates because they'd be so appalled by this. None of that happened, and again, it just seems like a really anachronistic institution that, although it's not like 50% of the class is getting in on legacy admissions, but to the extent that, again, in this moment, we're continuing a set of practices that are so discordant with this narrative that we're inaccessible, we're elite, it's intergenerational privilege being transmitted. I think it's really untenable practice that has been kept intact.
I'll save Janet the trouble by pointing out that UC does not have legacy admissions, and I believe never has had it.
I actually think, didn't California pass a law last year that outlaws legacy admissions in all universities that receive any state aid?
Yes. I was surprised to find out, though, that I assumed that because we were a public university, we didn't have legacy admissions, but there are public universities that do. Which I was shocked by because it strikes me as crazy. Why don't we take this as a moment
Thanks for that.
to open it up for questions? There's a microphone over here, and I see some questions in the middle. We're going to collect a couple of questions, and then we'll pick and choose how to answer to them.
Hi, thanks. I'm Jenna Bednar from the University of Michigan. Thank you for this amazing panel and this discussion about access. I wonder if we could pivot and think a little bit about the worries we all have about the state of our democracy and what you all see as the opportunity space for universities to strengthen our democracy. I mean, of course, President Daniels, you've written a brilliant book on this, so I wonder if, in the succeeding 4 years or whatever since publication of it, if you have learned a little bit more and you want to add to that, but are there programs that you see as being successful, and really what can be done?
So I'll speak very briefly and then turn to my co-panelists. I think as I argue, in the book, I actually think our institutions are indispensable for liberal democracy. I think we have a really important role to play in a number of different respects. And again, I think there's ways like getting rid of legacies, thinking more seriously about these issues around social mobility and so forth, but across a range of different areas where I think we really do have to lean into this moment and recognize that how we find our way out of this mess in the country, the deep level of polarization, the extremism we see that is growing up on all sides of our debates, I think we're a part of the solution. Again, and some of these things I think require lots of effort, thinking about curriculum innovation and how do we promote more sensitivity to civics education. Should that be mandatory for all students and so forth? I mean, again, one of the things we know that's really distressing is that only about 20% of American high school graduates will have had exposure to American civics. So we've actually got I think, again, given that we've got a lot of students coming to us who have never had proper exposure to the theories of democracy, to the structures of government and so forth, and the way in which you become a democratic citizen, I think we have a role there, and I think more and more institutions are recognizing that. I would say for me, the most exciting thing that has happened over the last several years across higher education is the extent to which there is now real intentionality around difficult conversations, creating environments and programs, courses, experiences where students are being forced to actually have conversations, explore positions with people who fundamentally disagree with them, and somehow finding in the best traditions of this country that you can still be capable of maintaining civic friendships, even with profound differences in outlook. And I think our institutions, again, particularly in a setting where so much of our country has been separated into enclaves, we have the bounty of, particularly for undergraduate experience, we have students for 4 years living cheek by jowl with one another. Again, if we do our job with a diverse array of backgrounds, perspectives, viewpoints, and so forth, to the extent that we're able in our institutions to help them model a better way of interacting, I think this is something that is quite exciting. And more than that, I think our students are deeply hungry for this. We found, and as I talked to colleagues who are leading institutions across the country, what they're really finding is that you're kicking in an open door with the students. They're exhausted by the anger, the animosity, and want something better. So I think that's a big role for us.
So at Fisk University, this is in our DNA. So we have the John Lewis Center for Social Justice that is still very actively engaged in the work we're doing there. Very excited about our new partnership with the Brennan Center and the executive director that we brought in to continue that work. Again, back to the culture of the institution, we're a small campus. Athletics are not our thing. Student activism is. And it's done through the clubs that the students choose to organize. Any student can start a club at Fisk by engaging 10 other students. And with that, they start clubs of whatever the interest may be. So far this semester, we've had several new clubs start. Black Girls Vote. I don't know if that's a formal organization somewhere or not. I know it's formal at Fisk. And not only is it about making sure every woman on the Fisk campus is registered to vote, but they're also asking every student at Fisk to make sure that they're registered to vote, bringing those tools on the campus to make sure. And now they're broadening the reach to the surrounding neighborhood and the community. There's such an interesting belief in knowing what the history of this school is about with the students who come there. And again, our opening remarks that define public policy. I love when you said, and I had to write this one down because the majority of our students come to Fisk for this, an opportunity for a good life. Because they value that being an option and an opportunity, it is fascinating to see how this activism is turning amongst the students. We all know we cannot direct as much as we would like to the work and activities of our students. But it is interesting to observe in this small environment how the DNA of a school born after the Civil War for the purpose of access has really continued to be a factor in how the students choose to self-organize and take advantage of that there in Nashville at Fisk University. It's really fascinating to see that resurgence right now. And then I'll just wrap up the remark by saying 2 days ago, we had an unannounced sort of surprise visit from one of your own, Kamala Harris. She was in Nashville for several things, a book tour and to do some fundraising and encourage the vote. And in the midst of this, in the new world she's a part of, wanted to stop by Fisk. So I think we got about a 2-hour notice, maybe an hour and a half. But that was okay, because what came out of that is that within minutes, students mobilized. And I mean within minutes. I was standing there looking at all the students thinking this has to be 60, 70% of our enrollment. She stood on the steps of Jubilee Hall and talked to them about the future of democracy is dependent on several things, but one of them is getting out to vote. So needless to say, she was very well received, and the enthusiasm, the energy around that, the fact that it was almost deafening to hear the pitch of the sound and their reaction to that when we didn't even know she would, one, be on campus. And then again, I'm sitting there thinking, do we have classes going on right now? And where did they all come from? But they were all there. So it's just a part of sort of this interesting culture that is a part of the DNA and the history of this institution. And I think that students that come there that may not have had it in their DNA before they got there, it doesn't last very long before they leave.
Yeah, I think I put a value on these particular policy centers and groups or clubs that focus on democracy or, active listening and things of that sort. My worry is that the people who attend and teach are in some respects self-selecting. And I think one of the challenges that we need to consider is how do we educate students in the values of citizenship who think it doesn't have anything to do with them. They're focused on acquiring skills and knowledge that will enable them to get a good job. And so one of the challenges I think moving forward is how do we integrate skills that are associated with being an active participant in our democracy: critical thinking, self-reflection, the ability to discern what is accurate from what is not accurate in this messy social media environment in which we exist. How do we integrate those throughout the colleges, throughout the curricula, as part of the day-to-day process of being a university student?
Thank you. We had two questions at the beginning that I want to pick up.
Hi.
So over here, and then if my eyes are right, Larry, over here.
Hi, my name is Nida Ose. I'm a GSPP alum, board member, and tech policy professional. My question is about our international students. It feels harder than ever to support and recruit international students right now. What are your institutions doing to navigate some of those challenges? And what does the future of higher education look like for international students from your lens?
Can we get the microphone over here for Larry? Sorry.
You want me to ask my
Questions and then take them as a group.
I'm Larry, Berkeley class of 1968, and follow-up question on student activism. I'm wondering why we're not seeing it in terms of as a response to the threats to the university system. Certainly, the students during the first Nixon administration believe that their activism had a profound effect on changing public policy. And the question is, where are they? Why don't we see more outrage on a national basis?
Anybody want to pick up on either of those?
Well, I'll pick up on international students. That was the first one. You know, the UC has a tradition of a pretty healthy population of international students. The top two countries of origin are China and India, but we have them literally from all over the world. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, the state legislature got all torqued because Berkeley and UCLA and San Diego had too many out-of-state students, which included international students, which was in part a result of the fact that during the recession, the state had cut its appropriation to the university a lot, and these students pay the full freight. So there was a commercial aspect to it. But there's a value aspect to it. And helping educate students of California, students from around the United States, and students from around the world is I think, an important part of the DNA of the University of California. There's tremendous pressure now. Students can't get visas. They can't get visas either to come and stay, or they can't get visas to stay after they graduate and contribute economically to the United States. And to me, that is just one of the many vestiges of a failed immigration policy nationally that we have in the United States. One would think or hope that this is one of the major issues that our Congress would take up. Yeah, good luck with that.
International student enrollment at Fisk has never been very, very high. Our students are primarily Nepalese, Nigerian, some from Ghana, because of our historical ties to those countries. As of today, we have not been impacted by that.
So I want to go to the question about where's the activism, where's the political salience on the part of the student bodies across the country around the set of changes that are taking place? And I've wondered the same thing. I don't have a good answer for this as to why this doesn't have more salience. These are students who are enrolled in institutions. They know what we do at our best. They know what's at peril. I'll give you an example. At Hopkins, like so many other private universities over the last couple of years, we experienced unionization of our PhD students. And, one would have thought, particularly given the impact, and it's real at all of the research-intensive universities, the reduction in PhD lines is a normal, natural consequence of the significant funding reductions that are taking place. Again, given how many graduate students, particularly in the sciences, are dependent upon faculty grants, R01s, that provide opportunities for graduate students and postdocs. Surprise, surprise, even with the union there now and thinking about this issue, thinking that this issue would be highly salient for them, it is not. It's other social issues, which is really interesting. Not bread and butter economic issues, not concerns about where the administration is. And I don't know, maybe at some level, it just reflects this sense that they can't be influential here, that the voice doesn't matter. But again, why, given what we saw since October 7th and the wave of campus activism around that issue, why would students thought they would have greater ability to influence that issue than this issue? So I think this is really perplexing to me.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have one over here, and I guess we'll go to this one first, and then we'll pass it this way.
Okay, thank you. I'm Alan Marks. I teach as an adjunct here at Berkeley Law, and I'm an alum of both Cal and Hopkins. And I want to come back to the question about research dependence on the federal government. And I know you mentioned the leverage that can give the government. In 1953, Milton S. Eisenhower, who was the president of Hopkins and the brother of the US president, warned about universities becoming dependent on federal money for research. Aside from the near-term contraction in capacity, which schools need, which the country needs, which the world needs, what's the better model from a university standpoint long-term, even assuming the federal government gets back into business of protecting the national interest?
The gentleman next to you.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Phil Thompson. I'm at MIT. I just wanted to comment on the last comment about, or 2 comments ago, about why isn't there more activism? And I just want to make an observation. At MIT, and I don't know if it's the same at Johns Hopkins or other schools, but the students who were protesting around Gaza on October 7th and all of that are really still pretty angry at the administration and how it was handled. And they tended to be students in the social sciences and, political science. We don't have sociology, but, students who are more in those kinds of humanities and social sciences kind of disciplines. The students and faculty who are being hit hardest by these current policies, reductions in research, are more from the sciences and engineering. And I will tell you, at MIT, many of those students have not taken a single course in civics. They don't know what federalism is. At our faculty meeting, a vast number of the faculty didn't know what the Voting Rights Act was, the faculty. And so I think there's a lot of anger. I'm seeing a lot of anger about what's going on amongst those students and faculty, but literally they don't know what to do, and it's interesting, because, and they don't communicate much with the students and faculty who are in the social side of things at the university. There's very little substantive interaction, at least at our university, around these things. So I just want to make that observation.
Yeah, to your point, that's the point I was trying to make about integrating across disciplines a greater civic awareness and education, because I think that's probably not an uncommon phenomenon. And it may be a partial answer to your question about where are the student activists on the issues that are happening that actually affect them right now. So, yeah.
So this is where I think ultimately, we're going to have to, again, this is on the faculty, contemplate that most outrageous of possibilities, that is mandatory programming, mandatory curricula, mandatory experiences if we're going to properly requite our responsibilities to essentially inculcate the norms, habits, knowledge necessary for effective citizenship. It's not inherited, it's taught. And again, I go back to, we start off with a student population that is not getting us in K to 12. And so if they're coming to us without this, and thinking about these mandatory moments. We do a lot of these mandatory moments. Literally, we have a democracy day in our first week of orientation, which is all about this. And then try and bring it into the residential life. So we're trying to find ways in which we can get at this, but I think it requires more intentionality. Can I pick up? I think this question about, the quote from Milton Eisenhower. Look, I think it's interesting you say this because we're celebrating this year our 150th anniversary. There's a large project that we've commissioned to get the history of the university done. I read over the summer, read the first, it's quite a tome, read the first draft of it. And I was struck by Milton Eisenhower, but he wasn't the only one who warned of this glorious partnership between federal government and universities could well become a source of vulnerability for us. And I think here we've got to acknowledge, though, for 80 years, it worked. It worked. And more than that, the leverage that Janet talked about a moment ago, which could have been utilized, by and large, almost never was. There was moments like Solomon Amendment and so forth where there were threats of this, but it's understood that the bounty that comes from this commitment to, one, very significant quantum allocated on a meritocratic basis to fuel the best ideas was something that was really good for the country. And the thought that it would actually end up where it is now is something that I think few of us, really imagine would have happened. I just want to say, as I mentioned before, I spent a good part of my career in Canada, and you just have to know how to the rest of the world, this partnership, the compact, not the new compact, the old compact, the compact between, that Vannevar Bush breathed into life, was a source of incredible envy. That is, that you would get this quantum, and that also it was this commitment to meritocratic competitive allocation, not entitlement, but earned right. So I guess for me, one, you're seeing the extent to which there is no intellectual property in this. If we look at the playbook that China is using now to shed us as a competitor across so many different technologies, it is this. It is significant investment by the national government in basically merit-based research grants allocated on a competitive basis. It's our playbook. So it's hard for me to imagine that something that's been so good, so valuable, ultimately is not going to be, particularly in this country, which is so deeply rooted in the power of science and technology, that we're not going to find a way to figure this out and get it back on track. But if it doesn't come back on track, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. There is no way that we'll ever see the alumni support, the foundation support, ever being able to make up for that retreat. It's inconceivable that the level of funding and how it's been funded will ever come back. And so that's why I think it's so important that we sort this out.
I think we just have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take one last question and then we'll close off.
I'm Bud Schenken. I'm on the board of advisors here at the Goldman School. Actually, my question follows something that you just said. Do you think that we are at war? That the administration thinks, I think, that they are at war with you. And when conditions change, very often you look for new leadership. The leaders that are in existence have to change what they've been doing. Do you see that as a need? Are you experiencing that? I don't see where the new leaders are coming, maybe from, you say there's no collective action. Is there really much sense that has to come? And is there much sense that leaders are going to come to do that? Or are people just saying, it's been great for 80 years and it's inconceivable that it will change, so we really don't have to do that much. We don't have to change where we are. That might be too general a question, but.
Might be a big question to take on in 2 minutes. I'll let Janet try, but.
Well, it's interesting because higher ed institutions, I've come to appreciate, are inherently kind of conservative institutions. They've been doing things the same way for a long time. It always cracked me up to see graduation ceremonies where we're wearing hoods and gowns from 600 years ago. It's like, really? Yeah. But I do think as we go through this struggle with an antagonistic administration, that we have to learn better tactics. We have to make positive change and truly address issues that have been raised and publicly address them. We need to focus on the basics, the education, the research, affordability, accessibility, excellence. We need to keep sending that message that in this era, in this century and moving forward, your education cannot stop at high school. You may not go to a four-year university, you may go to community college, you may go to a trade school, but there needs to be an expectation of post-high school education of some sort. And I think we need to have some confidence. As Ron said, look, the research enterprise in the United States has rebounded enormously to our country's success. And you want to say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The administration's in the process of trying to break it. Our job will be to restore it. That's my view.
I think that's a great note to end on. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. So thank you all. I want to thank all three of our panelists, Dr. Agenia Clark, president of Fisk University, Ronald Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins, and Janet Napolitano, my colleague at the Goldman School. Thank you.